main stage. Shouts about Biden, his worthy foe, claims witch hunts wherever he goes. Trump and court, his history's vacant, all alone his base forsaken, crying foul the jury's fixed, they're all Democrats, he lies and tricks.
Hey, what's up, Hello, everybody. This is Get Loud, and I am Princess Paradox. Alright, today we're going to be talking about Jack Smith and his court filings against Donald J. Trump and the January 6th insurrection. This is a 165-page document. 165 pages! And I'd be lying if I told you that we could go through this in just 20 minutes. So I'm making this a mini-series. Right now, in this episode, we're going over the entire thing, just to give you a broad overview of what was said, what the filing entails, and our general reactions. And then, in subsequent episodes, we're going to take a deep dive into 5 different topics covered in the filing, starting with presidential or personal. This is where we discuss what a president is legally allowed to do with the presidential immunity ruling by the Supreme Court, and where Trump crossed the line into the personal and broke the law. Jack Smith argues that Trump's post-election behavior wasn't about fulfilling the duties of his office now, but rather that he was doing anything necessary to stay in power. Episode 2, Lies, Lies, Lies. We're going to be talking about Trump's campaign of misinformation. We'll dive into how Smith alleges that Trump knew his claims were false about election fraud, and yet he persisted in spreading misinformation, and how he and his co-conspirators crafted a campaign to undermine democracy in the United States in order to keep Trump in office. Episode 3, Pressure. In this episode, we're going to be talking about Smith's filing and how it seeks to prove that Trump pressured both local critical battleground states and Mike Pence to overturn the will of the people and subvert democracy. Episode 4, Inciting Chaos. In this episode, we're going to be exploring how Smith suggests that Trump actively encouraged the riots and protests, which ultimately resulted in his followers storming the Capitol on January 6th. Episode 5. The legal fallout. This is where we're talking about Trump's failed legal defenses and what comes next. We're going to be talking about how Trump is going to probably defend himself against Smith's filing on presidential immunity. And we're going to talk about why, up until now, the courts have all rejected it and what this trial could mean for the future. But before I go too far into this, I want to introduce my co-host, Devin. He does not have a YouTube channel, but nevertheless, we're welcome to have him. Hey, Devin, introduce yourself.
Hey, yeah, glad to be here.
So, you've heard the introduction. You've been following this in the news. I know that you keep up on all of the legal commentary. What's your take on this?
So, here's the thing. A lot of people are saying that this is election interference. They're saying that, why are they doing this now during the last month of the presidential election? And here's what I think about that. None of this would be happening if not for Trump. The reason we have a 165-page filing is because Trump went to the Supreme Court and sought presidential immunity. The reason why it's happening now and not years ago is because of Trump's repeated tactic of delay, delay, delay. And he's delayed so much now that instead of this coming out to the public 2 years ago, it's happening right now. It's his own damn fault. And the only reason that he's salty about it is because he couldn't delay it until after the election. But, that's how the cookie crumbles.
He literally pwned himself in the face. It's like the guy who's back up at the start, sitting in the cave in Alterac Valley, and AFKing for 20 minutes, and then going on a rage in the general chat because he got kicked out of the battleground.
I don't really know what that means, but I'll take your word for it. Okay, so get this right. We're talking about these court filings, and let me tell you, they are juicy. I mean, seriously, like reading a political thriller. we're diving deep into the case against former President Trump.
Yeah, it's like getting a peek behind the curtain, you know? We're not just talking about Trump here either. These filings, they give us all these different perspectives.
I know, right? It's not just him. It's like advisors, campaign staff, even Pence. They all have their say in this thing.
Like, to really get what went down, we got to rewind back to the 2020 election, right? Neck and neck, a real nail biter. But right off the bat, Trump was convinced he could only lose one way.
If the election was rigged, right. He kept saying it over and over.
Exactly. And these filings, they show us it wasn't just for show.
Oh no, this was behind closed door stuff. Like imagine, okay, you're a fly on the wall, and Trump's own advisors are telling him straight up bullshit.
It's amazing, isn't it? They're telling him his fraud claims are bullshit, that they won't fly in court. But does he listen?
Well, that's the thing, right? Instead of listening to the people he's paying to give him advice, he goes rogue, starts calling up officials in those swing states himself. You know, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, trying to get him to, just toss out the results.
Like he's trying to overturn a call on the football field after the referee's already blown the whistle.
Exactly. Total Hail Mary. And it wasn't just Arizona. These filings show a pattern, you know, him going around the system trying to pressure these state officials directly.
All while his lawyers are getting their butts handed to them in court, by the way, case after case thrown out. But they're over there trying to create this alternate reality.
Oh, totally. Like they can just will their way to victory, you know, public pressure, backroom deals, whatever it takes.
Trying to manufacture enough doubt, enough chaos that maybe, just maybe, those state legislatures will say, okay, let's just ignore what the voters said.
Right. And here's where it gets really crazy. This whole fake elector scheme, I mean, talk about audacious.
Yeah, and it wasn't just some harebrained idea they kicked around either. It was organized. Memos, meetings, the whole 9 yards. They were scrambling to get these fake elector certificates ready before January 6th.
It's insane. And the thing is, they were trying to keep it all hush-hush while
Yeah.
they're out there in public screaming about a stolen election.
Two sides of the same coin, right? This big public show, all fire and fury, and then this behind-the-scenes maneuvering to, let's be honest, rig the system in their favor.
And it all leads up to January 6th, right? But before we get there, we got to talk about Pence. Because he becomes, let's just say he becomes a very important player in all of this.
Yeah, Pence, right. He kind of gets thrust into the center of this whole thing, especially with January 6th looming.
Because Trump's whole plan hinged on Pence. The
Right.
idea that Pence could just, wave a magic wand and throw out the real electors and swap them with the fake ones on January 6th, game over.
Except it doesn't work like that at all. And the filings show that Trump was told this. I mean, even his own attorney general was like, dude, no.
So what? He just surrounded himself with people who would tell him what he wanted to hear.
Kind of seems that way. Like he's so fixated on this idea that Pence is going to pull a rabbit out or a hat for him that he tunes out anyone who says otherwise.
Talk about being in your own reality. But it makes you think about the pressure on Pence. Can you imagine?
the weight of the world on your shoulders.
Yeah.
And the filings show how far Trump was willing to go to make Pence crack.
Oh, yeah. Like that comment right before January 6th. Go down in history as a patriot. Or, well, not exactly subtle.
It's intense, right? It shows just how personal this whole thing was for Trump and how far he was willing to push.
And what happens when Pence doesn't budge?
Well, that's when Trump really lets him have it. Speeches, Twitter, you name it. Even at that rally right before the Capitol, Trump throws Pence right onto the bus.
Yeah. That whole Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for our Constitution bit, knowing full well that Pence had already told him it wasn't happening. Just, wow.
It's really something, using this idea of patriotism to, manipulate the crowd, turn them against his own VP.
It's chilling. But in a way, it sums up the whole thing, doesn't it? Trump willing to burn it all down, even sacrifice Pence to get what he wanted.
And he lost. It's incredible. I mean, think about it, right? All of this happened out in the open for everyone to see. But somehow, these court filings, they still managed to unearth stuff we didn't know.
Makes you wonder about the whole system, doesn't it? I mean, how could this even happen in the first place?
Right. Like, how fragile is all of this if a president can almost overturn an election? What does that say about us?
It's a scary thought. And these filings, they don't really give us the answers, do they?
No, they don't. But they show us the cracks, the weaknesses in the system that someone like Trump could exploit. And he almost did.
Definitely something to think about. And it's a good reminder, right, that this whole democracy thing, it's not a given. We got to fight.
All of us, every single day. Because what's the alternative? Totally. And that's the thing about Trump, right? Even after January 6th, after all the chaos, after everything fell apart, it's like he doesn't even care.
It's wild, isn't it? You'd think, I don't know, seeing the Capitol like that, people getting hurt, wouldn't that make you stop and think?
You'd hope so. But everything he's said since, even in these filings, it's like it never even happened. Still pushing that stolen election stuff.
It's unbelievable. And even suggesting he might pardon the people who stormed the Capitol.
It's like he's trying to rewrite history,
Or maybe just create his own reality.
Yeah.
Where January 6th wasn't a total disaster, but some kind of victory lap.
It's scary, honestly. What does that say about us? About what we're willing to accept?
It's a lot, and honestly, kind of depressing. But hey, we got to face it right. This is where we are.
Head on, right?
Exactly. So yeah.
Definitely a lot to unpack, but that's why we're here. We're going to break it down for you. It's like we're getting a backstage pass to how the law tries to handle presidential power,
Especially when things get as messy as this.
Right. And this whole thing really seems to come down to the idea of what counts as official actions by a president and what are just private ones.
Why does it even matter?
Exactly. Like, why does that difference even matter?
And what I think is so interesting here is how this uses all of these seemingly small actions, like tweets, to try and build a case about this person's intent. It's not just about what they did, but why they did it.
Okay, so let's try to unpack this a bit. So the document lays out this whole idea of presidential immunity, which I guess is kind of like a legal shield that's supposed to protect presidents from lawsuits while they're in office.
Right.
But here's the thing. It's not some kind of magical force field.
No, not at all. The question is, when does that shield actually work? It only really applies when a president is actually doing their job, not when they're acting on their own personal interest.
So, like, if a president is just acting like any other candidate in an election, even if they're also the president, this immunity might not protect them.
And that's a key point. 'Cause were this former president's actions after the election, like part of his official duties as president, or were these the actions of someone who just really wanted to hold on to power? And we're talking phone calls, tweets, private meetings, everything.
We have to talk about that 2 outs, bottom of the ninth call. I mean, that just sounds like something straight out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah, this uses this really, really vivid language to describe what was going on and just the pressure of these events. And one of the advisors actually described a state's governor as being in the 9th inning, 2 outs, and the former president's team was just desperate for a comeback.
Yeah, you can really feel that urgency, especially when it describes the pressure that was put on some state officials to try and overturn vote counts. They even wanted them to put forward these alternate slates of electors. Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, we should probably clarify that whole alternate slates of electors thing because it's kind of key to understanding everything else.
Yeah.
Basically, remember how each state gets a certain number of electors based on how many people live there? And then those electors are usually the ones who actually vote for the president.
Right.
Well, some of the former president supporters were trying to put forward their own unauthorized lists of electors who would support him, even though he lost the popular vote in those states.
So it's like they're trying to change the score of a game after it's already been played. Wow.
Exactly. And that's where these allegations get really serious because the document seems to argue that he might have crossed a line by trying to interfere with the election process like this. It's suggesting that he was acting out of self-interest, not really as part of his official duties.
Right, so it's like he was playing a whole different game. So if this immunity stuff doesn't apply, then what happens? What are the consequences here?
Well, if the courts decide that what he was doing wasn't covered by presidential immunity, he could be vulnerable to legal challenges. It's not just theoretical anymore. We could be talking real-world consequences here.
Okay, so we've kind of set the stage here. Presidential immunity is not a free pass, and the line between official actions and private actions can get really blurry. But how does this actually back all of that up? I mean, it just seems like it would be hard to prove what someone's intentions really were.
They're trying to put together this puzzle using all these very specific actions to try and figure out what was going on in his head. Like we're talking phone calls, speeches.
Really? Even tweets? Wait, they're using his tweets as evidence.
Yeah. Because think about it. The way that someone acts on social media, especially when they think everyone is watching, can actually tell you a lot about their state of mind.
Yeah, I guess you're right. It's like that saying, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog.
Right.
Unless you're tweeting like a president who's trying to overturn an election.
Exactly. And in this case, the document's arguing that his tweets, especially in those weeks right after the election, were a key part of how he was trying to cast doubt on the results and like rally his supporters.
Okay, well, speaking of rallying supporters, we have to talk about January 6th because this does not shy away from that at all.
No, it does not. Yeah, it really goes deep into that speech he gave right before the attack on the Capitol. And they go through his words very carefully, pointing out how he kept saying that the election was stolen, even though his own advisors were telling him there was no evidence of widespread fraud.
So he was getting like conflicting information, but he chose to believe what he wanted to believe.
It seems that way, and actually point to this one quote that's attributed to him where he allegedly says, the details don't matter about the allegations of election fraud.
Wow, the details don't matter. That's pretty troubling.
Yeah, it is. And it gets even more unsettling when you look at what the document calls the Justice for All Choir.
The Justice for All Choir? What is that?
So apparently, after everything that happened, the former president had this group of individuals, all of whom were facing charges related to the January 6th attack, sing for him, like a personal concert.
Wait, are you serious? That's kind of bizarre.
Yeah,
And also very telling. It's like a very defiant act.
exactly. It kind of feeds into this question, how do you hold someone accountable for their actions, especially someone as powerful as a president, when there are all these people who seem willing to support them no matter what?
It's honestly kind of terrifying. Like, what do you even do when the facts don't seem to matter? When people are willing to overlook anything just because they support the person?
It's a really sobering thought. And it kind of brings us back to why this matters in the first place. This isn't just about one person or one election. This is about protecting the very foundation of how our democracy works. The idea that we, the people, get to decide who governs us.
Right. It's not the other way around.
Exactly.
And I think this is where it gets really, really interesting to me because if this presidential immunity thing doesn't apply, what does that mean going forward?
And that's exactly what this wants us to think about.
Okay, so we've gone really deep into these legal arguments, looked at some specific things that happen, and uncovered some pretty wild details. But, like, what does it all actually mean? What's the takeaway for just the average person?
I think that's such an important question because this is not just some, like, dry legal analysis. It's really a warning about how fragile democracy can be, especially when we're talking about the power of the presidency.
Yeah, it feels kind of like something out of a movie.
It does feel dramatic, but that's exactly the kind of scenario this is laying out. Like, it's arguing that if a president can just use their power to stay in office, even after losing an election, then that sets a precedent.
And then any president could try to do the same thing.
Right. And then it's like suddenly elections don't matter as much anymore. The will of the people could just be ignored.
That's a scary thought. So, like, how do we even prevent that? What can we do to protect ourselves against something like that happening again?
Well, the good news is, it also talks about some potential solutions.
Good.
One thing it really emphasizes is how important it is to have a really strong and independent court system. We need courts that can hold even the most powerful people accountable.
So no one is above the law, not even a president.
Exactly. And it also talks about the role of Congress. Like it's their job to keep an eye on what the executive branch is doing and to make sure that elections are fair and transparent.
And that means that we as citizens have to do our part too. Like, we have to actually be informed voters and hold our elected officials accountable for protecting our democracy.
I think that's the biggest takeaway here. We can't just sit back and assume that everything's going to be fine. We have to actually be engaged. We have to speak out against things we think are unjust and demand that our leaders uphold the principles of democracy.
It's definitely a landmark case. And yeah, what we're seeing here is a challenge to how we view presidential power. What they're basically saying is that a president's actions, especially those taken as a candidate rather than in their official capacity, aren't always protected by immunity.
So what you're saying is, just because you live at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue doesn't mean you get a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Exactly. And that's where this distinction between official and unofficial actions becomes crucial. The filing spends a lot of time really breaking down these actions taken by the former president and where they fall on that spectrum, because it's key to determining if presidential immunity applies at all.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. Give us some examples. What kind of actions are we talking about here, and how is the government saying these were unofficial?
So let's take those infamous calls to state officials in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan. The filing argues that these weren't about presidential duties like signing legislation or deploying troops or anything like that. They were about something far more personal.
Trying to overturn election results, definitely not in the official job description of the president.
Exactly. The filing paints this picture of a campaign operating outside established legal channels and instead resorting to pressure tactics to get what they wanted. And it goes on to say that these actions, even if by a sitting president, shouldn't be shielded by immunity.
And they're not just making these accusations, they have receipts. Talking dates, times, who was present, what was said, like that call to the Arizona Speaker of the House where they're allegedly pushing for decertifying electors based on those unsubstantiated fraud claims. They lay it all out.
They're building a narrative piece by piece using this very specific evidence to support these claims. And it's not just what was said, but also the context, the intent behind it.
It's one thing to hear this reported in the news, but to see it all laid out in black and white in a legal document that's got to be impactful.
Absolutely. And what I think is so fascinating is the precedent this sets. This isn't just about one former president. The outcome of this case could totally redefine how we view presidential power and accountability for generations to come.
Talking about a seismic shift in how we understand the presidency itself. Okay, so we've talked about the pressure on state officials, but what about those infamous tweets? Surely a president tweeting falls under free speech.
Not so fast. The filing argues that Trump's use of his personal Twitter account wasn't about making official statements, but more about advancing his own personal interests as a candidate. They're saying these weren't presidential pronouncements, but really tools to try and influence the election.
So they're saying his tweets could be seen as evidence of intent, even part of a coordinated effort. That's kind of wild.
Exactly. They pull out specific tweets, like those attacking the Georgia election officials who contradicted his fraud claims, and connect them to real-world consequences, like those officials receiving threats.
It's chilling to think those tweets could be used as evidence in a criminal case.
And it gets even more intense. The filing doesn't shy away from the January 6th rally at all. In fact, they dedicate a significant portion to it.
Because it wasn't just a rally, right? They're arguing it was a calculated part of the plan.
Exactly. They're saying it wasn't an official presidential event, but a campaign event orchestrated to pressure then Vice President Mike Pence and disrupt the certification of the election.
Okay, so we're talking about phone calls, tweets, even a rally all being used to build this case. It's really starting to feel like a legal thriller where the stakes are incredibly high.
And it even gets more granular. They lay out a timeline of Trump's actions on January 6th itself.
You mean even while the attack on the Capitol is happening?
Yes. They point out that he was active on his phone, specifically the Twitter app, during those critical hours. It's as if they are alleging he was more concerned with staying in power than fulfilling his duty to protect the country and the Constitution.
Wow, okay. So they're painting a picture of a president who's crossed the line from simply contesting an election to something far more serious.
Exactly. And it raises a huge question. What does this mean for the future of the presidency?
It's a question I'm sure a lot of people are asking right now.
Yeah, no doubt about that. It's definitely a high-stakes situation. And you're right to point out the gravity of this. To really understand what's going on here, though, we need to dig even deeper into the specifics.
Okay, yeah. Let's do that. We talked about the pressure on these state officials. Remind me about those calls to Arizona, Georgia, Michigan. What exactly went down?
Okay, so picture this. It's just days after the election has been called for Joe Biden. And the filing claims that Trump, along with his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, placed a call to Arizona Governor Doug Ducey.
Ducey. He's a Republican, right?
He is.
Def.
And he had already certified the election results in Arizona. But despite this, the filing claims that Trump pressured Ducey to try and find evidence of fraud, even going as far as saying, I need a big win here.
Wow. So even with a fellow Republican confirming the win, Trump was still pushing this narrative.
That's what the filing alleges. And it's worth noting that Ducey, along with other Arizona officials, resisted those pressures. They publicly defended the integrity of their election process, even as Trump continued to make claims of fraud.
Talk about standing their ground. Okay, so that's Arizona. What about Georgia? Those calls got a lot of attention.
Absolutely. They allege that Trump, again with Giuliani, called Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr. This time, they were trying to dissuade him from joining a lawsuit that challenged the election results.
So they weren't just going after these state officials. They were trying to influence the legal challenges as well.
That's how it looks. And perhaps the most well-known call, the one that really thrust this whole pressure campaign into the spotlight, was that call to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger.
Oh, yeah. I just want to find 11,780 votes call.
That's the one. That recording sent shockwaves through the nation. The filing uses that call, and others like it, to argue that Trump wasn't just expressing concerns. He was actively trying to interfere with the election process even after multiple recounts and legal challenges had confirmed Biden's win in Georgia.
It's like they're building a case that he was willing to disregard the official process, the rule of law, just to hold on to power.
That's definitely the picture they're painting. Beyond just the phone calls, they also highlight Trump's very public statements, specifically his tweets, as further evidence of this intent.
Okay, wait, well, hold on a sec. Tweets are just words, right? How can they be used as evidence in a criminal case?
Well, it's not just about the words themselves, but the context and the impact. They're arguing that Trump used Twitter, his preferred method of communication, to target specific individuals who are contradicting his claims of fraud.
Like those election workers in Georgia, the ones that he accused of manipulating votes.
Yes, exactly. Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, they became the subject of really intense online harassment, even death threats, after Trump publicly attacked them.
Oh gosh, that's awful.
It is. The filing argues that those tweets weren't just expressions of opinion, they had real-world consequences and should be seen as part of this larger effort to intimidate and silence those who stood in his way.
It's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
It shows the power of words, especially coming from someone in a position of authority.
Absolutely. And that leads us to perhaps the most significant event in this whole saga, the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. This event plays a really big role in the filing.
I bet they don't hold back in their description of that day, do they?
No, they don't. They lay out this whole detailed timeline of Trump's actions on January 6th, starting with his speech at that Save America rally. They highlight specific lines from that speech where he told the crowd to fight like hell and we're going to walk down to the Capitol. They're arguing that those words, combined with his months-long campaign to discredit the election, directly incited the violence that followed.
So they're saying he wasn't just expressing frustration, he was intentionally directing his supporters to disrupt the certification process.
That's exactly what they're saying. They point to evidence that Trump was actively following the events at the Capitol even as they unfolded, and that he delayed taking action to try and stop the violence for hours. It's as if they are suggesting he was more concerned with staying in power than actually fulfilling his duty to protect the country.
Wow, it's hard to believe this is all happening in America. It feels like something you would see in a movie, not real life.
It is a very unsettling situation.
Right.
We are in uncharted waters here, legally and politically. And the implications of this case are enormous.
It really makes you wonder what precedent this sets for the future.
Absolutely. This is a question we should all be asking ourselves. What happens now? The outcome of this case will have a lasting impact on how we view the limits of presidential power and the importance of upholding the rule of law. It's about the very foundation of our democracy.
Okay, so we've talked about the calls, the tweets, the rally, the events of January 6th. What else does this filing cover? It feels like there's so much more to unpack.
You're right, there's another layer to this. The filing also looks at the efforts to create these alternate slates of electors in several states. Remember, these were groups of individuals who met on December 14th, the same day as the official Electoral College vote.
Yeah, and they cast ballots for Trump even though he had lost those states.
Exactly. It was almost like creating this shadow government hoping to cast doubt on the legitimate results and potentially seize power through illegitimate means. The filing alleges that Trump was directly involved in this scheme, working with allies like lawyers John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani to orchestrate it.
But how could they think this would actually work? Surely these alternate electors wouldn't have any legal standing.
You would think so, right? But the filing suggests that this was all part of a larger strategy, a last-ditch effort to create enough chaos and confusion that they could pressure then Vice President Pence to reject the official electors on January 6th and instead recognize these alternate slates.
It's like they were trying to game the system, exploit any loophole they could find. Did they really think they could pull it off?
It's tough to say what they were thinking. But the filing says they even had this legal memo outlining this strategy, this roadmap for how they could potentially overturn the election.
So they're saying that this wasn't just a bunch of random actions. It was a deliberate, coordinated plan.
That's what they're alleging. And they have the receipts to back it up. They cite specific emails, memos, witness testimonies that point to a coordinated effort.
That's a lot of information they've uncovered.
Yeah.
Kind of mind-boggling.
It really speaks to the scope and depth of this investigation. They left no stone unturned.
But hold on. How did they even gain access to all of this? Don't presidents have some kind of executive privilege that protects their communications?
They do, but it's not absolute. That's where this whole debate about presidential immunity comes in.
So they're basically arguing that if Trump was involved in a crime, he can't hide behind his former title to avoid accountability.
Precisely. It's a complex legal argument, but at its core, it boils down to a fundamental principle. No one, not even a president, is above the law.
Seems like a pretty straightforward concept when you put it like that. But I imagine it gets complicated when you're talking about a former president.
You're absolutely right. And it's a concept that will likely be tested in the months, maybe even years to come as this case unfolds. This is a pivotal moment in our nation's history.
So what happens next? What are the possible outcomes here? I mean, this is all so unprecedented.
Well, the first hurdle is for a grand jury to decide if there's even enough evidence to indict Trump. This is a huge decision. It's basically deciding if there's enough evidence to even put him on trial.
And if he is indicted?
Then we move into the trial phase. Both sides will present their arguments, and a jury will ultimately decide his fate. It's important to remember that he's presumed innocent until proven guilty.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
But still, if he's found guilty, what then? What are we talking about here?
It's uncharted territory, so it's hard to say for sure. The potential penalties could range from fines to probation, even jail time. It's really difficult to predict what a jury would decide.
Wow. It's almost too much to wrap your head around. The potential consequences are enormous, not just for Trump, but for the country as a whole.
Absolutely. This case goes far beyond one man. The outcome could have a profound impact on future elections, on how we view the presidency, and on the very fabric of our democracy.
Okay, so we've covered the calls, the tweets, the alternate electors, January 6th, a whole debate about presidential immunity. What else is there? What really stood out to you in this filing?
You know, I think what's most striking is the sheer amount of evidence they've compiled. They've clearly been incredibly thorough, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, gathering emails, text messages, phone records, social media posts, you name it.
It sounds like they built a very compelling case.
They've certainly presented a comprehensive and detailed account of the events. It'll be fascinating to see how this all plays out. The implications are far-reaching.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But before we move on, I can't shake this feeling, this whole situation, the attempts to overturn the election, results, the pressure on officials, the questioning of the peaceful transfer of power. It all feels familiar somehow.
That's a fascinating observation, and you're not wrong to feel that way. What you're picking up on is this recurring theme throughout history. Attempts to subvert democratic processes to cling to power through extra-legal means, these are not new phenomena.
It's like we're seeing echoes of the past play out in real time.
Exactly. And that's something I think is worth exploring further. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines, the immediate crisis. But if you can step back and look at the bigger picture, the historical context, it can give us some valuable insights.
So you're saying we should look for parallels in history, see if there are any lessons we can learn from past attempts to undermine democracy.
Precisely. It might help us understand not only what's happening now, but also how to prevent similar situations from happening again in the future.
That's a great point. So, where do we even begin? What are some historical examples that come to mind?
Well, there are several. One that jumps out is the Reconstruction era following the American Civil War. It was a time of immense political upheaval and social change. Newly enfranchised Black citizens were voting and holding office for the first time, and that triggered a backlash from those who were determined to maintain that old order.
So kind of similar to how some people reacted to the changing demographics and political landscape in recent years.
Exactly. And just like we're seeing today, there were efforts to suppress votes, intimidate voters, even overturn election results during Reconstruction. One of the most egregious examples was the disputed election of 1876.
Wait, I think I remember that from school. Wasn't that the election that basically ended Reconstruction?
You got it. It was a very close election between Samuel Tilden, a Democrat, and Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican. Tilden actually won the popular vote, but the electoral votes in several southern states were disputed.
And this was at a time when those states were still heavily influenced by former Confederate leaders.
Right, and those leaders weren't too happy about the idea of a Tilden presidency because he had been a big advocate for protecting the rights of Black citizens. So what happened was a period of intense political maneuvering and backroom deals. Ultimately, a special electoral commission awarded the disputed electoral votes to Hayes, making him president.
But it wasn't without controversy, right?
Oh, absolutely not. The Compromise of 1877, as it came to be known, is widely seen as a betrayal of Black Americans. Basically, in exchange for Southern support for Hayes' presidency, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, which effectively ended Reconstruction and ushered in that long era of Jim Crow segregation and disenfranchisement.
Wow, it's amazing how these events can shed light on what's happening. It's like we're seeing a repeat of the past, just with different players and slightly different circumstances.
You hit the nail on the head. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And in this case, the parallels between Reconstruction and our current political climate are really hard to ignore.
So what can we learn from this? What lessons can we take from the Reconstruction era to make sure we don't repeat those same mistakes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think one of the biggest takeaways is the importance of protecting voting rights and ensuring equal access to the ballot box. During Reconstruction, the disenfranchisement of Black voters paved the way for decades of oppression and inequality.
And we're seeing similar efforts to restrict voting access today, especially among minority communities.
Exactly. Another crucial lesson is the need for accountability and a commitment to the rule of law. The Compromise of 1877, while it was made in the name of political expediency, it ultimately undermined the very principles of democracy and justice. It showed us that when we prioritize power over principle, it can have devastating consequences for generations to come.
So you're saying we need to be vigilant about safeguarding our democracy and holding those in power accountable, regardless of their political affiliation.
Absolutely. We can't allow political opportunism or partisan interests to erode the very foundations of our democratic institutions. The stakes are just too high.
Okay, so we've talked about Reconstruction, but are there any other periods in American history that might offer some valuable insight into what we're seeing today?
Absolutely. Another period that might resonate with what we're going through now is the tumultuous 1960s.
The 60s, a time of huge social change, civil rights protests, political assassinations. How does that relate to what we're seeing now with Trump and the efforts to overturn the election?
Well, the 60s were a time of immense change and division in America. The civil rights movement was challenging centuries of racial segregation and discrimination, and the Vietnam War was deeply polarizing the nation.
Kind of like how the issues of racial justice and foreign policy have been flashpoints in recent years.
Exactly. And just like today, there were deep partisan divides and this growing distrust in government institutions. People were really questioning the legitimacy of those in power and demanding change.
We saw that distrust boil over into violence a few times during the 60s, with riots in major cities across the country.
You're right. And then there were the political assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr., which shook the nation to its core and further fueled the sense of instability and disillusionment.
It was a tumultuous time, to say the least. But how does this relate to the specific allegations against Trump and his efforts to overturn the election?
Well, I think the 60s really highlight the fragility of democracy and the real dangers of political polarization. When trust in institutions erodes and people feel like their voices aren't being heard, it can create a breeding ground for extremism and violence.
So you're saying that Trump, by repeatedly casting doubt on the legitimacy of the election and stoking his supporters' anger, created an environment where something like the January 6th attack was more likely to happen.
That's certainly one way to look at it. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that Trump wanted his supporters to storm the Capitol or that he condoned what they did. But I do think his rhetoric, combined with the broader political climate at the time, undoubtedly played a role in what happened.
It's just like he created a powder keg and all it took was a spark to set it off.
Exactly.
And I think it's a cautionary tale for us today. We need to be careful about the language we use, especially when it comes to these sensitive issues like elections and the peaceful transfer of power. Words have power, and when leaders use inflammatory rhetoric, it can have dangerous and really unpredictable outcomes.
Okay, so we talked about Reconstruction in the 60s, but are there any other historical examples that might be helpful to consider?
Absolutely. Another period in American history that might be relevant is the Red Scare of the 1950s.
The Red Scare? You mean the McCarthy era? With the witch hunts for communists and the blacklisting of Hollywood actors and all that?
That's right. Now, it might seem strange to compare that era to our current political climate, but there are some interesting parallels.
Okay, what?
Well, both periods were defined by this fear of internal subversion and this willingness to sacrifice civil liberties in the name of national security.
So are you saying that Trump's claims about a stolen election and his efforts to overturn the results were driven by that same kind of paranoia and fear-mongering as McCarthy?
Potentially. Remember, Trump repeatedly said that the election was rigged and that there was widespread voter fraud, even though there wasn't any actual evidence to support those claims?
Right, he kept saying things like, stop the steal and we have to take our country back.
Exactly. And this kind of rhetoric, just like McCarthy's claims about communists infiltrating the government, created this climate of fear and suspicion where people were primed to believe these conspiracy theories and turn towards more authoritarian solutions.
So basically you're saying that Trump, like McCarthy before him, was exploiting people's fears and anxieties to gain more power.
That's certainly one interpretation. And it's a good reminder that we need to be wary of leaders who use fear and division as a way to consolidate their own power. When we let fear control our actions, we risk sacrificing the very freedoms that make democracy strong.
That's a powerful message. So if there's one thing we can learn from these historical examples, it's that democracy is incredibly fragile. how we have to be constantly vigilant to protect it from those who would undermine it.
I agree. We can't afford to take our democracy for granted. We have to be active participants in protecting it.
It's crazy how those historical examples you mentioned, Reconstruction, the 60s, even the Red Scare, they all show how fragile democracy really is. It's like this constant fight to protect it.
It really is. And, it reminds me of another period in history that might seem even further back, but has some really striking parallels to what we're seeing today, the fall of the Roman Republic.
Okay, now we're going way back
Mm.
to togas and gladiators.
Yeah.
What does ancient Rome have to do with Donald Trump and the 2020 election?
Just hang with me for a minute, because the parallels are pretty fascinating. The Roman Republic, much like the United States, prided itself on its system of checks and balances, this tradition of civic virtue and the peaceful transfer of power.
Sounds familiar, right? Those are the very things that feel threatened today.
Exactly. But the Roman Republic, even with its strengths, eventually fell apart. Internal divisions, powerful people taking advantage of those divisions, a gradual erosion of those democratic norms, it all added up.
I think I see where you're going with this. You're saying that Trump, by challenging the election results and going against these democratic processes, was acting like one of those ambitious Romans who put their own interests above the republic.
It's a good analogy, I think. Think about Julius Caesar. He was this brilliant general and really charismatic leader who steadily gained more and more power. Eventually, he crosses the Rubicon River with his legions and throws the whole republic into a civil war.
And didn't that basically mark the end of the Roman Republic and the start of the Roman Empire?
Yeah.
Are you saying that Trump's actions, if they hadn't been challenged, could have led to similar changes? Really big and potentially destructive consequences for American democracy.
It's a question worth thinking about. Now, I'm not saying Trump is Julius Caesar or that America's on the verge of becoming an empire, but history shows us very clearly that democracies aren't invincible. They can collapse. And to keep that from happening, it takes constant attention and a real commitment to democratic principles from leaders and citizens alike.
That's a pretty sobering thought. We tend to think about democracy as something that's just there and always will be. But the truth is, it's fragile. It needs to be constantly cared for and protected if it's going to survive.
You're exactly right. And protecting it means learning from the past. By looking at history, by understanding how and why democracies have failed, before we can be better prepared to protect our own.
So if there's one big takeaway, we need to be much more aware of those echoes of history around us. We need to be able to see those warning signs and call out any attempts to weaken democracy, no matter who's doing it or why.
I couldn't agree more. We all have a responsibility to protect our democracy. It's not a spectator sport.
Well said. This deep dive has been eye-opening, that's for sure. It's more than just a legal case. It's a story about power ambition and the constant struggle to protect democracy.
And it's a story that's still being written.
Absolutely. Well, to everyone listening, thanks for joining us. Remember, keep those historical lessons in mind, and don't be afraid to ask those hard questions. The future of our democracy might depend on it.
I'm a tiny little dot on the YouTube map, throwing parties in my room, hoping someone might tap with you so few. I'm dancing in stealth mode, trying to go viral, but I'm about to implode. Ooh, like and subscribe, you can join my solo crowd. Like and subscribe if you're alone and like it loud. Like and subscribe, come on baby, make my day. Like and subscribe, here we go, ready, set, let's play. I set to like my fridge, kind of empty and bare. Throwing tracks into the void, hoping someone might care. Making tracks for the walls, a solo date. Masturbating to my beats in a fanless landscape. Ooh, like and subscribe, you can join my solo crowd. Like and subscribe if you're alone and like it loud. Like and subscribe, come on baby, make my day. Like and subscribe, here we go.